So today I want to talk to you about attribution of sources and how we use in-text citations. This lecture is actually going to encompass a bunch of different topics, from plagiarism to first attributions to using in-text citations. It kind of runs the whole gamut, so bear with me. Anyway, the reason that we attribute sources, we give credit, whether you're making use of sources in an essay or you're summarizing, paraphrasing, or quoting, it's important to give credit to that source. So the attributing information to sources, it accomplishes a number of important tasks. It helps you to avoid accidentally stealing or plagiarizing the work of others by acknowledging someone else's work and giving credit where credit is due. It also helps to quickly establish the credibility of your own research. It provides the reader with a helpful transition in the essay. It clarifies differences between your information and knowledge and that which comes from research or from other people, right? So the difference between your own words and somebody else's words. It also helps you to sound more professional, more academic, right? And it protects you in the event that information is incorrect or is upsetting to the reader. So for example, you use a quote and one of your readers gets upset because it's a misrepresentation. You can say, well, I didn't say that. That was said by this person that I was quoting, right? So the burden is a little bit off of you. And of course, you need to know when you give credit. When do you do it, right? It's when you quote directly, it's when you paraphrase information, and it's also when you summarize from a variety of sources. It's really important to give credit where credit is due. So I want to talk about the topic of plagiarism. In college courses, we're continually engaged with other people's ideas. It's, we're joining that scholarly conversation. I think I've spoken about that before. We read them in text, we hear them in lecture, we discuss them in class and incorporate them into our own writing, especially in this course where you're using sources to help support your argument. As a result, it's very important that we give credit where it's due. Plagiarism is using others' ideas and words without clearly acknowledging that source of information. So any person's ideas, opinions, or theories, any facts, statistics, graphs, drawings, any pieces of information that are not common knowledge, any direct quotations of another person's actual spoken or written words, we have to be aware there that it's not just for text, but for a variety of things. Also, when we paraphrase someone else's spoken or written words, it's also important to give credit to that person. So plagiarism includes, but it's not limited to, the intentional use by paraphrase or direct quotation of the published or unpublished work of another person without full and clear acknowledgement. It also includes the intentional, unacknowledged use of materials prepared by another person or an agency engaged in the selling or distribution of essays or other materials. So if you go to a website like Course Hero and you see a paper from English 102 that a student submitted several semesters ago and you're like, oh, I'm just gonna borrow a few things, and you don't give attribution, that's really, 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 really bad. And these are the types of things that actually show up when you turn your work in and it goes through Safe Assign. Those are the things that Safe Assign picks up on, and it sends out an alert to your instructors. So in our English syllabus, this says English 101, but it's the same policy for all of our English classes. Sanction for plagiarism is at the sole discretion of the instructor, and it will be addressed on a case-by-case basis. Penalties may include failure of the assignment, failure of the course, and or institutional action through the Office of the Provost. I've only failed one student because of plagiarism, and that was unfortunately, right at the beginning of the pandemic. I felt really bad about it, but this student had blatantly plagiarized his final paper. So, these things happen. I don't like to do it. I like to give students the benefit of the doubt, but it's really, really a very serious thing. So you'll notice this from one of the videos that I assigned for you to watch this week. I had initially thought that by having you do the plagiarism workshop that was done through the library, that it would kind of nip things in the bud, but that hasn't really been the case. I think there are still a few things that need to be addressed as far as properly giving attribution to your sources. And I think it's good to raise awareness for students that there are various types of plagiarism. So the 10 types of plagiarism video that's on YouTube, I think is a really interesting one to show that there are various types of plagiarism, the various ways that students either intentionally or unintentionally plagiarize. So I just wanted to enforce that and make sure that you do watch this video because it's very important information. So that's it for plagiarism, right? Now we're going to go about learning how to actually write in a way where we can incorporate sources and make it all very seamless and give proper attribution and have a decent paper, right? So how do we give proper attribution to sources? Using a source for the first time, I like to say, is like introducing people to each other at a party. People feel much more comfortable talking when they know each other's names, right? So this type of introduction is also important because it can quickly give two strangers something to talk about. So you don't just jump right in, right? The first time that you use a source, you need to make a complete introduction. And that introduction must be complete so the reader knows the source by name and can then distinguish that source from other sources, right? A complete first attribution also establishes the credibility of your source, and it allows the reader to take that information seriously. So as I said, you don't just jump right in. You're going to explain to the audience whose ideas you're introducing. And the way you do that should be you include the author's full name, first and last. You provide their credentials. In other words, explain why that author is reputable. You could say, so-and-so, a professor of law at Columbia University, writes blah, 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 right? You would also include the name of the publication if that's available to you. And if you're lacking those first two things, if you don't have a named author and you don't have a reputable publication, which is the case for many articles in a periodical, you would use the title of that publication or news service instead to show that there's at least some kind of credibility, that it's not just something that you found on the internet that some no-name person wrote because it's their opinion, right? So there's a couple of things to keep in mind here. Sometimes you will find newspaper articles that are unsigned. They're just written by a staff journalist. And in this case, it's perfectly acceptable to provide attribution without an author's name. Sometimes there's a news service like the Associated Press or Reuters, and that's listed where an author's name would usually be. So if that's the case, the name of the news service is all that you would need for an in-text attribution. And I'll show you some examples in a minute. Another thing to keep in mind is the author's relevant qualifications, and you need to be really careful here. Many bylines might include a title such as staff writer, reporter, or contributor, and those really are not relevant qualifications. It just means this person got paid to write this. It doesn't really mean that they're, super special people, right? They're far too vague to use as credentials for determining credibility. And if that's so, and you can't confirm the relevant qualifications for a periodical contributor, then don't include relevant qualifications in that first attribution. Instead, rely more on the credibility of the publication for which they're writing. So if so-and-so staff journalist at the New York Times writes something, just say, according to a New York Times article, blah, 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 right? That's all you need. Another thing to keep in mind that there are many people who contribute articles to magazines and newspapers who have other really prestigious jobs, other jobs that are more important than being writers when it comes to establishing their credibility. So say, for example, Barack Obama wrote an opinion editorial for the New York Times. Would you list him as a New York Times writer or attribute him as a New York Times writer? No, you'd say former President Barack Obama wrote in the New York Times that blah, 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 right? So there you have his credibility as being former president and not just some Yahoo who's written an opinion in the New York Times, right? Of course, they don't just let anybody write an op-ed piece for the New York Times, but I digress. So hopefully this makes a little bit more sense of why it's important, and you do that the first time. So let's take a look at some examples of first attributions. And these are just kind of, some of them are kind of silly. The first one is anyway. According to Dr. Philip Bryant, director of the veterinary medicine program at North Carolina State University, dozens of flying donkeys are born every year. So of course, it's kind of a ridiculous statement, but we're establishing credibility here, right? We have the author's full name, Dr. Philip Bryant, as well as his credentials, the director of veterinary medicine at a very large university, right? So we establish the credibility that way. Here's another example. According to Jeremy French in a New York Times article, the mayor was on vacation and unaware of the city manager's decision. So here we have the author's full name, and the credibility here really lies upon the New York Times. New York Times is one of the largest newspapers in the world, known all over the world. So it's pretty reputable, right? Next example here is we don't have an author that's named, but we rely on the credibility of the publication. This one is the Akron Beacon Journal reports that the suspect is now in custody and awaits arraignment. So the Akron Beacon Journal might not matter much to those of us down in Cincinnati, but I'm sure it is probably the newspaper in Akron up north. So here we're just relying on the reliability and the credibility of that publication. And as I said before, you can also just use a news service such as Associated Press or Reuters. So according to the Associated Press, which is sometimes abbreviated as the AP, the judge will pass sentence sometime next week. So when you do that first attribution for a source, you might need to trim down the amount of information that you have about an author in order to avoid wordiness. So for example, Dr. Philip Bryant, he may be the director of veterinary medicine and teach this, that, and the other thing, and he might be the dean. You have to choose which title is most applicable, right? It could be somebody who wears many hats and does many important things, but to keep all of those qualifications in might sometimes be a matter of having to figure out, is it really relevant, right? You can continue to list further qualifications of your source if they're relevant and they establish credibility. But if they're not relevant, like, you know, say Dr. Philip Bryant also runs a volunteer organization that has nothing to do with flying donkeys. You wouldn't say anything about that because it's not relevant. You really want to choose the most relevant qualification. Here, he is the director of veterinary medicine, so he knows what he's talking about when it comes to flying donkeys, right? You get the idea. Okay, so let's move on. You may have noticed in my feedback to you that I have talked about signal phrases. Use a signal phrase here, right? And what is a signal phrase? Well, a signal phrase indicates to your audience, to your reader, when you as a writer are going to paraphrase or summarize or quote a source. It's your way into it. It's kind of introducing the borrowed material. So it introduces the audience to a source by using the author's name or reference to the source in research. And then we use an active signal phrase verb that's in present tense. So, you know, it's similar to what I've been talking about in first attribution, but you do this each time that you are introducing source material. So you do it when you're introducing paraphrases, when you're summarizing things, or when you're quoting. And because without a signal phrase, your readers are going to have trouble knowing whether the information presented is your original thought, or if it's something based upon research, something that you have borrowed from somebody else, right? So let's take look at a couple of examples. Here we have two examples done in different ways. Science writer Fred Pierce shows that global warming and hurricane intensity are related. So you'll see here, we have the full name of the writer. We have an active verb here, shows, and it's in the present tense because that's how MLA likes things, that global warming and hurricane intensity are related. So we see here, we don't have any quotation marks, so we have to assume that this is paraphrased information, yet this writer still provides a citation for where that information can be found on page 46. You can do this in several different ways. So you're saying the same thing here, okay? But let's see how this second signal phrase works. We start by using reference. We start by referring to the publication. Research in the online magazine New Scientist demonstrates that global warming and hurricane intensity are related. But then again, we have the citation here. So again, you can do this in a couple of ways. You can name the author. If you name the author in your signal phrase, you don't need to put their name in a parenthetical citation because we already know where to find that information in the work cited, because you will look up Pierce and we'll find it, right? Here, though, we're referring first to the research, right? Research in the online magazine New Scientist. So the research in a publication, here's the active verb. Same thing is being said in both of these, except now we need to know who wrote it, right? Because we haven't mentioned Pierce in the signal phrase, we need to make sure that your reader knows where to find it. If you have a named author, then that name is going to show up in your works cited rather than the name of the publication first, right? We always want to make it as easy as possible on our readers to find that information. So hopefully that makes sense. So we've talked about summarizing and paraphrasing, right? And there's ways to summarize or paraphrase using signal phrases. So you can begin with the author's full name or refer to that research, just like we did in that previous slide. You could use a signal phrase, use the signal phrase verb that clearly indicates how the author has conveyed the information. So for example, it shows, argues, claims, suggests, so on and so forth. And then after using the author's full name for the first time, your subsequent references should be by last name only, and I'll explain that in a couple of slides. If it's available, that is, if you're using a publication that actually has page numbers, like a PDF that might have page numbers on it, you would include that page number of the original text in parentheses at the end of your summary or paraphrase. It's so important. I cannot stress this enough. By providing that parenthetical citation or giving that attribution to the person's original ideas, you are showing your readers that, yes, this is information that I've paraphrased, that I've borrowed, I've synthesized, I've summarized. It's not my original thought. However, I'm going to expand upon that, right? Because we don't just drop borrowed information for no reason. And I'll explain that in a minute too. So here, let's take a look at a summary. This is an example of a summary. Science writer Fred Pierce shows that global warming and hurricane intensity are related. His article reports that researchers at the Georgia Institute of Technology studied past hurricane and climate statistics and determined that warmer ocean temperatures in recent years have caused an increase in the intensity of hurricanes. This research claims that the incidence of Category 4 or 5 hurricanes has increased from 20% during the 1970s to 35% during the past 10 years. So here we have named the author. We're using active verbs that are in present tense, referring again to the research itself. And then we have that citation at the end. So by having the citation here at the end, your audience knows where to find the information that's been summarized. And you do similar things with quoting material. Again, you're going to begin with the author's full name is the first attribution, or refer to the research. You will use the active signal phrase verb that clearly indicates how the author conveys the information. One thing about quotations is you need to be choosy. You want to get the most bang for your buck. So there are things that writers do when using quotations, and these are some little tips and tricks. So we use ellipses, those 3 dots, to show text that we want to leave out. So it's perfectly fine to quote the beginning sentence of a paragraph, and then you go and skip several sentences and then find another part of that paragraph that you also want to include in the quote. And you can use those ellipses to show, okay, I've skipped some information here, but here's the most relevant parts to me. Likewise, you can also insert brackets, the square brackets, to show that you have added some text. And we will do that in cases where we want to make it grammatically correct. Perhaps you need to include words like and or but or however, or use articles such as a, an, and the. And that just shows that this is my own text that I've inserted in the middle of a quote. And it makes the writing flow better so that you're not using, for example, like back-to-back quotes and that kind of thing. So ellipses and brackets are your friends. And again, be choosy with your quotes. If you're going to quote directly, make sure that it's really relevant, that it makes a lot of sense, and that it says something better than you can say yourself. If the author's statement is written in such a way that you couldn't say it any better, then use a direct quote. If you think you can say it better, or at least as well, then you could paraphrase or summarize, right? We use quotes. We don't want to use huge quotes all the time. We don't want to quote really long chunks throughout your paper, because that's just telling me that you really can't come up with some ideas of your own, right? If you're borrowing so much information from other writers, that's not writing. You know, that's just inserting quotations, right? You're inserting block quotation after block quotation. That tells me that you still have a little bit more work to do as far as synthesizing the information and presenting your own original ideas, right? Yes, we want you to use evidence. We want you to use support, but we don't want you to fill your whole paper with other people's words, because that's pointless. That's not the point of the exercise. The point of the exercise is for you to present your own ideas, your own argument, your own opinions, and say, and you should believe me because these people have also said it, right? You're not showing me anything if you say, this is what so-and-so says, and this is what so-and-so says, and this is what so-and-so says. I'm concerned with what you think. You have a voice, you have ideas, you have opinions that should be expressed. And that's what I'm interested in. And yes, if you can say, well, see, I'm right because these people are right too. And these people have a lot more knowledge than I do, right? So I'm interested in what you have to say and what you think. So use your quotes sparingly, but use them and give proper attribution. All right, so quotation example here is in the essay, Santa Ana, author Joan Didion's main point is, and whatever you want the main point to be, right? According to Didion, and choose a quote, Didion also writes, quote, finally, she argues, quote, and those quotes can be found on pages 42 to 43. So here we have the title of her essay, we have the name of the author, we're using active verbs, and we have the citation. So this is just short example. So some things to keep in mind. Article titles can sometimes be wordy and disrupt the flow of your essay. So sometimes mentioning the title of an article is not the best approach. Furthermore, if an article is from a syndicated news source, it might appear in many newspapers with many different headlines. So if you have something from the Associated Press, it could show up in the Cincinnati Enquirer as one headline and show up in the Akron Beacon Journal with another headline. So the main problem is that first attribution is supposed to establish credibility of sources, and article titles often don't do anything to accomplish that task. So even though it's not technically wrong, it can make the writing more awkward and more clunky. Also to remember, it's never acceptable to refer to a source by first name only. We are not pals with them. We are not friends with them. We are showing a sign of respect when we use the subsequent citation or subsequent mentions of them by using their last name. You can refer to the author by last name in subsequent citations, but you never use their first name. So I don't want you saying, Kimberly said this. Who the heck is Kimberly, right? I don't know who Kimberly is. Oh, Crenshaw, yes, or Dr. Crenshaw, yes, you can do that. Another thing to keep in mind is to avoid using vague or confusing verbs. For example, an article in the Cincinnati Post says, or the article states. That drives me nuts, right? Articles don't say or state or report. People do that. So instead, try using the word write if there's an author who is writing, or use the word says if the person in your quote is actually speaking, like in an interview. So for example, Kimberly Crenshaw says, or in her TED Talk, Crenshaw says, right? Or Crenshaw argues. Use those active verbs. So here is a handy chart of active signal phrase verbs. And you'll see there are plenty here to go through. And this is one of the most important elements of good writing, and using proper attribution is verb choice. Often you make mistakes by choosing non-descriptive or vague verbs, like I said before, to introduce quotations from their sources. That verb to state is one of the biggest offenders, sadly. It sounds important and it sounds official, but in truth, it's kind of vague when it's used this way. So it'd be much more precise for you to show exactly how those ideas are expressed. I'm not fond of say either, or says. I'd much rather have claims or argues or points out or speculates. Since the reader of your essay has not read the entire book or the article, whatever you're referring to, and that you're using as your source, it's important for you to show the reader that you're aware of the tone and intentions of the original source. That is, what is the original context of each quote or the idea that you're using? Use better verbs in order to be more specific. So refer to this chart, and I may actually provide a handout for you instead of having you come back to the PowerPoint for this. But yeah, these active signal phrase verbs are important. Another thing I want to point out, and this is an MLA thing, an MLA versus APA and other styles. Typically, MLA wants you to use active present tense. So you would use analyze or analyzes or argues. Of course, you're going to use the proper verb endings according to what your subject is as you're writing. But yes, definitely make it present tense. I don't want to see said or noted or argued or anything like that. It's always present tense. So moving on, still talking about citations. I had you watch this video, Citations and Quotes from Study Hall Composition, Arizona State University and Crash Course. This YouTube video is really helpful. So by setting the stage for your quotes, paraphrase, and summaries, you provide context for your readers, right? And then you'll follow up the borrowed information with proper attribution or citation, and then you provide an explanation of your chosen support material, the quote, etc. And then you will make connections to your other ideas or points. And this makes the job of reading easier for your audience. So don't forget SWAGG. S is for stage setting. W is the words that you're quoting or paraphrasing. A is attribution. That would be your in-text citation. Or if you're using the signal phrase with the author's name, that's how you give attribution. G, go into detail, giving context, providing context, explaining things. And then the second G is going forward. Make those connections for your readers. And this is a similar thing. We have introduce, quote, cite, and connect. With introduce, notice that the subject and verb of the sentence with the quotation is often in this part. A concrete, simple subject and verb are often the key to making this complex sentence clear. So choose a clear subject. Good choices for the subject will include who wrote it. So that would be the author's name, or if you have more than one author, it might be authors or author et al. Or if you're writing in a literary context, who said it, the character's name, that kind of thing. And then how and where it was published, the type of writing it is, along with the type of piece or the journal in which it appeared, an article in the Journal of International Business Studies, for example. Then choose a vivid verb or an active signal phrase verb. Remember to use present tense, as I just said, according to MLA guidelines. And then you have your quotations, which is quoting, paraphrasing, or summarizing. Remember that quotes are used to emphasize a distinctive opinion, tone, or style. And they analyze rhetorical and literary devices, and it's also used to provide a basis for disagreement. And you indicate your quotation, your direct quotation, with the quotation marks, the double quotations, as well as a clear citation. With paraphrases, you use them more to emphasize facts rather than opinion, tone, or style. But again, you also indicate with a clear citation, usually in parentheses at the end. And with summaries, usually you summarize to emphasize main ideas rather than supporting details of a source, or to provide accepted background information. You may also summarize from several different sources. Once again, you indicate that with a clear citation, and yes, you can cite more than one source in a parenthetical citation when you are summarizing. So say, source A and source B both say similar things and you're just summarizing all of those ideas, you can then have source A, whether it's the author's name or the article title, a semicolon, and then source B. And if you have page numbers, you would throw those page numbers in there as well. And you can look up how to do that, how to cite multiple sources. You can look that up on the Purdue OWL website. Pretty easy to find. Then you cite. MLA citation is designed to provide, hopefully, an unobtrusive way to direct readers to the complete bibliographic information that is in your works cited so that they can look up the source for themselves. In general, what appears in an MLA-style parenthetical citation refers the reader to the first element of the appropriate entry in works cited at the end of the essay. And in general, the parenthetical citation applies only to the sentence in which it appears. That is why if the sentence ends with a quotation, the period goes after the citation rather than inside the closing quotation mark. That's just kind of one of those quirky MLA things. So you want to make sure that you can use the citation to find that full bibliographic information from the list of works cited at the end of the paper. If your citation has the title of the publication or the title of the article, when in fact you actually have a named author and your works cited is listed by the author's name, your reader is going to have more trouble locating that source. Yes, you've provided all the information, but you haven't really provided the right information in the citation to make it easier for your reader. You don't want your reader to have to work extra hard. And then lastly, connect, which is kind of like the second G in going forward. Actually, the two Gs, you're going into context and you're going and making connections for your reader. So how your evidence relates to your main idea might be obvious to you because you've been reading about it and researching it and you know all this stuff, but it's not obvious to your reader. It won't be obvious to your reader unless you make those connections. So the connection between evidence and conclusion takes some interpretation. And if you don't provide your readers guidance, you risk them interpreting your evidence in a different way and not connecting it to your argument. So you really need to be explicit there. That's why at least one sentence incorporating important concepts from both your source and your main idea is critical in connecting those two things for your readers. Simple as that. You make the connections for your readers don't have to work as hard. Now, that is completely different from advice we give in creative writing. We don't want things to be too tied up with a bow. We want the readers to be able to make connections and ideas for themselves in creative writing. But in academic writing, especially argumentative writing, you really need to be explicit and make it absolutely clear what it is that you are saying so that your readers understand and are able to connect to your ideas. So why do we do this in the first place? Well, I call it joining the conversation, right? We have this ongoing scholarly conversation, and it has been going on since before we came into the picture, and it will continue after we move on. So one of my favorite people to read on Twitter is Dan Martin. He's a scholar, a rhetoric scholar, and a writing program administrator at Central Washington University. And he has a very interesting Twitter thread that's pinned to his page and that I have actually embedded in our Blackboard course. I encourage you to actually read through the whole thread because it's fantastic. But there he discusses the beauty of using citation as a means of fostering this conversation between writers' minds, sometimes across generations. And he refers to what he calls textual DNA. So that by all of these different citations, we are mapping out the textual DNA of the scholarly conversation. He also points out that each citation style, whether it's MLA, APA, Chicago, so on and so forth, they all have various rhetorical purposes. They each have their own rhetorical purpose, where some information is more important than others. And that citation also acts as, quote, an entryway into academic conversations. And you'll see here, I actually provided brackets there that I inserted myself. So I encourage you to read through that whole thread, because it ends up here. It's this conversation between students and instructor, and the student comes to a conclusion. So a works cited or reference page is about entryways into conversations. I can use it to follow a trail of connected research. And yes, that is the whole point, that you can join in on this conversation that's been going on. You've contributed your piece, and now you're going on your merry way so that others can read after you and follow in your footsteps. And I just think that's a fantastic thing. That's probably one of the most beautiful things about writing, that we can connect with minds spanning generations, right? We can read things from ancient Greece to, up to now. And then when we're gone, people who come after us will be able to read what we have written. I just think it's a really fantastic thing. So here is my credits page. I am, of course, indebted to our former English chair and current Dean of Humanities and Sciences, Jeff Wolf. He has this fantastic English 102 handout, and I derived much of the information for that presentation from that handout. And since his presentation, or this presentation, is all about giving proper attribution, notice how I used the author's name, his credentials, and omitted the title of the handout, because that's best left until the very end in my works cited. So here you see the citations from videos that we've watched, citation from a website that I got some information from, and of course, the citation from Dean Wolf's handout. So, ta-da, the end. So hang tight for some more information that I pulled from a couple of lectures that I did last semester. It should be fairly short, I think, just following up with about 7 or 8 more minutes of information. And this is to ensure that no quotes are left naked. You can't just drop a quote and run. You really need to provide some context. And there are several different ways that you can use this. So we have tag, introduce, embed, and split. With tag, you have your quote first, followed by words to provide context. So you see here, driven by the realization that women often do not benefit from development activities, and in some cases become even poorer and more marginalized, sorry, can't talk. The Center for Development and Population Activities developed an interest in studying gender roles and responsibilities. And then we have the parenthetical reference there. You could also introduce with a signal phrase, and this is the method you're probably most familiar with. According to the Center for Development and Population Activities, or you could say according to yada yada Smith. The interest in gender roles and responsibilities has been, quote. So here the quote, it's the same, it's just in a different place in the sentence. Likewise, you could embed, you start out with your own phrase, have the quote, and then you continue with your own phrase. So the phrase is similar to this one up here. And then again, you have your parenthetical reference. Or you could split the quote. That last one is kind of interesting. So you would use part of the quote, driven by the realization that women often do not benefit from development activities. And then you have your own words. The Center for Development and Population Activities has studied gender roles and responsibilities over the past decade and discovered that, in fact, then you continue with the rest of the quote. Note here that brackets are used to help with the context, to help with understanding, because that was not in the original quote. So that is the ties handout. So this is how to write a supporting paragraph for the argumentative essay using what we have been calling in the department the PREC system, PREC. It helps to ensure that your supporting points are following a logical pattern, and it aids you in incorporating your research into the final product smoothly. So remember that you are using those outside sources, whether pre-selected ones or the alternative ones that we've agreed upon, and you are going to use quotes or paraphrases from those outside sources to help support the points that you're making in your essay. So PREC or PREC stands for point, rationale, example, and conclusion. There are 4 main parts of each of your supporting or body essay or body paragraphs, sorry. So these work for your body paragraphs, not really for the introduction or conclusion. Remember, the introduction and conclusion are treated a bit differently, and we don't usually include our research in the intro or conclusion. We may refer to something that we're talking about, but we don't usually use citations or anything like that in our intro or conclusion, but we do in the body paragraphs. So if you remember, each paragraph, whether it's an introductory paragraph, a body paragraph, or a conclusion paragraph, they all start off with a topic sentence, right? For the introduction, it's that hook that gets your readers interested. But for the body paragraphs, it's those topics that you hopefully have brought up in your thesis statement. So you remember from the previous essays that your supporting body paragraphs need to be united by a single main idea. So we refer to that main idea as topic sentence, and each of the topic sentences for your body paragraph should flow logically from one to the next. So the topic sentence is that which states a main idea of the paragraph. And then the other sentences or the other information that's in the paragraph is going to support that main idea. So you start off with a very logical and interesting topic sentence for your body paragraph. That is that first point that you're going to raise in your essay. Next, you have a rationale section. And that rationale section is going to provide an explanation. It's going to develop and support the topic or that point that you raised in that paragraph. So that section of the paper is going to include your own summary. You may paraphrase the outside source material that you're going to use to make your point. So the rationale section is also going to establish the context of the source material that it's about to use, showing its relevance to the writer's point. It kind of paves the way for that direct quotation that you're going to use. Next, we go to the E of PREC, which is example. So the example section of the paragraph is going to introduce that outside source material that you've chosen. Typically, we do that in the form of a direct quotation to support the point that you're going to make, or the point, that topic, excuse me, of the paragraph. So remember that you need to provide context for the source by introducing it to the reader. And we talked about this in week 13, how we have various approaches to giving attribution to that material. So you're going to have that identifying tag phrase, that signal phrase, so-and-so says, so-and-so argues, right? Using vivid verbs, so on and so forth. So that quotation needs context, right? You can't just drop it and run. You can't have what we call the naked text, right? You need to give the reader some context so they know where your information is coming from. So the parenthetical citation will look like this. So you have your identifying phrase, your signal phrase, you have your quotation. If you want to refer to that ties sheet that I introduced in week 13, go ahead and do that. You can mix it up a little bit and take a little bit more of a mature approach to how you use quotations, but make sure that you have that parenthetical citation, right, at the end of the sentence. That indicates where that information has come from, and it helps your reader, once they look in the works cited page, to see where you got that outside source from. Okay, so you have point, rationale, and example. The last part of the paragraph is going to be a conclusion. Just like you have a conclusion in your paper, you also have some concluding information in your paragraph. So the conclusion section summarizes or reinforces the position that you've taken, and it ensures the relationship between your idea and the quoted material is clear, and that it supports the point that you're making. And you can do this process for as many supporting points in your paper that you have, and that ensures that the paper is logically ordered and easier for your audience to follow and understand. Again, it's best to just limit the PREC method to your supporting paragraphs only, your body paragraphs only. It's not going to work really well if you try to use it in the introduction or in the conclusion. Those are treated differently, and we've talked at length about introductions, and hopefully we'll talk a little bit more about conclusion paragraphs since we are in an argumentative essay. So I realize that that's a lot of information that you've had to absorb. Hopefully the chapter titles have helped you to advance through the video and skip over places where you didn't really need the information and to go to spots in the video where information was more relevant for you. I know that it's review for some of you, but I felt I wasn't doing my duty if I didn't present this information at least once in the course for those of you who are still having difficulty with giving proper attribution. Maybe you're struggling with how to incorporate sources. So I just kind of lumped everything together into one longer video. I didn't want to post several different videos just because, I don't know. I didn't want to seem like I was completely recycling information from previous semesters, even though I have used a few snippets from videos that I've done previously. I hope that this information has been useful for you, and if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to me. Again, I'm very flexible with the due dates and with your submissions, but I also don't want you to get too far behind, because then it gets really difficult trying to catch up, especially with assignments such as the thesis statement and annotated bibliography. That's a really long assignment. It takes a lot of thinking, a lot of researching to make sure that the sources that you're using are the correct ones. And of course, you don't want to have to do that all over again when you go to write your papers. So the idea is to do the annotated bibliography, so then you have sources that are credible and useful and you can use when you write your paper. So yeah, best of luck with your essays, and I hope that you use some of this information and that you feel like you are becoming more confident as writers, more confident using credible sources, and just confident in general as a learner. Again, email me if you have any questions. Okay, take care. Bye-bye.